3 men appeared at Abraham's tent near the great trees of Mamre. I should call them men because that's what they looked like. Human form, human clothing, walking on human feet up the road from the south in the heat of the day. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent, and when he saw them, he ran to meet them and bowed low to the ground. I recognized 2 of them immediately. Michael and Gabriel, in the physical forms they took when God sent them into the human world on specific assignments. I'd served under both. I knew them by the weight of their presence, by the authority that radiated from them regardless of the form they wore. The third I did not recognize. He looked human, and he moved like a human. He accepted Abraham's hospitality the way a traveler would, sitting in the shade while Abraham rushed to prepare food. But the weight of his presence was different from Michael's and Gabriel's. As if the other 2 were carrying borrowed authority, and this one was carrying his own. Abraham treated the 3 with extravagant hospitality. He had Sarah prepare bread. He chose a calf from the herd, tender and good, and had a servant prepare it. He brought curds and milk. He stood near them under the tree while they ate. They ate, all 3 of them. Michael and Gabriel ate food prepared by human hands, and I noted that without surprise, because angels can take physical form and interact with the physical world. But the third one ate too, and something about that bothered me in a way I couldn't put into words. Not wrong, not concerning. As if the act of eating was both natural and impossible for him. Then the third one spoke. "Where is your wife Sarah?" he asked Abraham. "There, in the tent," Abraham said. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," the third one said, "and Sarah your wife will have a son." A son. Through Sarah. Within the year. The promise that had hung in the air across a quarter of Abraham's life, that had survived Egypt and Gerar and the Hagar disaster and the long silence after, was being given a time. Not someday, not eventually, next year. Sarah was listening from inside the tent. I heard her laugh, not the bright laugh of joy, but the short, bitter exhale of a woman who has heard a promise too many times to believe it again. She was 90 years old. Her body had passed every threshold for bearing children. The thing wasn't just unlikely, it was finished. "Why did Sarah laugh?" the third one said to Abraham. His voice carried no rebuke, only a question. And then, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" The Lord. He said it about himself. Not, "Is anything too hard for God?" as if pointing to someone else. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" As if he were the Lord, sitting in the shade of Abraham's tree, eating bread baked by Sarah's hands. How could God be seated here in human form, and also be in heaven? How could the maker of the stars accept a meal from the creatures he'd shaped out of dust? I looked at Michael, whose face showed the careful reverence of someone in the presence of an authority he serves, and Gabriel's expression matched it. They knew who this was. They served him with a deference. They showed no angel, no matter how highly ranked. I filed it away with Melchizedek, with the bread and wine from a priest king I couldn't explain. Another piece of a puzzle I was collecting, without seeing the picture. Sarah denied laughing. "I did not laugh," she said from the tent, afraid. "Yes, you did laugh," the third one said. "Not angry, not harsh, just certain. The certainty of someone who knows things he shouldn't be able to know, who hears what happens inside a tent while sitting outside of it, who hears the thoughts behind the words." Then the 3 of them stood to leave, and they looked towards Sodom. I felt the shift. The air around the camp changed the way pressure changes before a storm. The visit had been warm, hospitable, intimate. Now a harder thing came over the conversation. The third one turned to Abraham, and what he said next was not a promise. It was a certainty. He said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see whether what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me." Michael and Gabriel started toward Sodom, while the third one remained with Abraham, And Abraham, the man I'd watched tremble before Egypt and lie to Pharaoh and repeat the same lie to Abimelech, did something I'd never seen a human do. He stood his ground and argued with God. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham said. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" The burn on my arm ached, and I don't know why. Maybe because the weight in the air was heavier than anything since the covenant vision. Maybe because the subject was destruction, and destruction carried its own pull. I pressed my hand against the scar and listened. "Far be it from you to do such a thing," Abraham said, "to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? You don't argue with God. That's what I believed since the beginning. You receive His word and you obey. You may ask questions in the throne room, in the quiet moments when His presence is warm and welcoming. But you don't stand in front of Him on a road in Canaan and tell Him what would be unworthy of His character. Abraham did, and God didn't rebuke him. God engaged. "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom," God said, "I will spare the whole place for their sake." The air thinned or thickened, and I couldn't tell which. It was doing things I hadn't felt before, moving with the exchange between a human and God, as if the words themselves had weight. The scar on my arm pulled tighter with each number, as if it could feel the stakes being measured out. Abraham pressed further. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. "What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50, he asked. "Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? "If I find 45 there," God said, "I will not destroy it." "What if only 40 are found there?" Abraham said. "For the sake of 40, I will not do it," God said. Each number was a step closer to a truth Abraham didn't want to reach. I could see him calculating, wondering whether Sodom held 40 righteous, though he couldn't know, since he'd visited Lot and seen the city. And each number he offered was smaller than the last, because his memory of the place kept revising the count downward. "May the Lord not be angry," Abraham said, "but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" "I will not do it if I find 30 there," God said. Abraham's voice dropped. "I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes. What if only 20 can be found there?" The man who had been credited with righteousness, who had defeated kings and refused Sodom's wealth and built altars across Canaan, called himself dust and ashes. And he kept going, because Lot was in that city, and Lot's family, and whatever decency might still survive in a place that had made corruption its custom. "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it," God said. "May the Lord not be angry," Abraham said one more time. "Let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" "For the sake of 10, God said, I will not destroy it." 10. Abraham stopped at 10, not because God refused to go lower, but because Abraham couldn't bring himself to ask. To ask, what if only 5, or what if only 1, would mean admitting what he already feared, that the city his nephew had chosen, the green valley that had looked like paradise, might not hold even a handful of people who weren't already lost to the thing they lived in. 10 righteous people. That was the line. In all of Sodom, if 10 could be found who hadn't been swallowed by the city, the whole place would stand. The third one departed. Abraham stood alone on the road, and I could see his face working through the count. Lot was there, and Lot's wife, and Lot's daughters, and Lot's sons-in-law. I wondered if there were 10, and if there could be. I thought I knew the answer. I'd been watching Sodom from a distance as part of my assignment, and the air over that city was the thickest concentration of fallen I'd come across since the world before the flood. The corruption ran deeper than what any one person did. It had soaked into the whole of how they lived together. The fallen had worked there for generations, with the same patience Surreal showed everywhere, and what they'd made was a place where wickedness wasn't just allowed, it was celebrated. Michael and Gabriel entered Sodom at evening. I followed at a distance with 4 other angels. "Investigation," Michael had said. "Verify the outcry and see whether the reality matched the reports." It was worse. It was worse. The weight of the place hit me before I crossed the city walls. I'd felt fallen gathered before, at Ziggurat, in the formations I'd mapped in the southern territories, in the ruined settlements I'd surveyed after Babel. None of them came close to this. The air in Sodom was so thick with fallen presence that moving through it felt like wading through something that didn't want me there. The scar on my arm flared the moment I entered, a sharp, cold ache that climbed up my arm and into my shoulder and didn't ease until I pulled back to the outer edge of the city. The fallen were everywhere, not hidden, not folded into the background as serials worked in other cities, but out in the open for anyone with the sight to see. Dozens of them moved through the streets among the humans, so tangled into the daily life of the place that I couldn't tell where the people's own wickedness ended and the fallen's pole began. They'd had generations to work here, and what they'd built wasn't a fortress or a formation. It was a way of living, and the city was their making. I could smell the place. I could smell the place. Earth smells reach angels differently than they reach humans. But Sodom had a scent that came through to me as burning oil and overripe fruit, with a deeper note under both that I can only call rot given a pulse. Lot met Michael and Gabriel at the city gate and insisted they stay with him. His face when he saw them carried the frantic warmth of a man who recognizes his own kind in a place where his own kind had vanished years ago. He knew what happened to strangers in Sodom at night, so he all but dragged them inside, prepared a meal, baked bread, and played the host with the desperate care of a man trying to prove that decency still existed where it had nearly died out. Then, the men of the city surrounded the house. I heard them gathering before I saw them. Voices from every direction, calling to each other, the sound of feet on packed earth moving toward Lot's door. This was not a few men stirring up the rest. It was the whole city. Young and old, from every quarter, pressing into the street outside Lot's house until the crowd filled it wall to wall. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they shouted at Lot. "Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." The words carried through the door, and Lot went out to them. He closed the door behind him and stood between the mob and his guests, and he tried to reason with people who had left reason so far behind that his appeal sounded foreign to them. I'd seen violence before. I'd watched Cain raise his hand against Abel. I'd watched the world before the flood sink into organized cruelty. But this was different. The violence here wasn't an eruption, it was custom. The men pressing against Lot's door weren't even angry. They spoke as though what they wanted was theirs by right, and that Lot stood between them, and it offended them more than anything they were asking for. The fallen in the crowd fed on it, not directing, not whispering, because they didn't need to. They were simply there, taking in what they'd cultivated, watching their harvest come in. Whatever Sariel built in other cities, slow and quiet and pressing, had reached its full-grown form here. The corruption fed itself now, and the fallen could stand back and watch. "Get out of our way," the mob told Lot. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They surged toward the door, and Lot stumbled backward. Michael and Gabriel reached through, pulled Lot inside, and struck the men with blindness, not as punishment, but as necessity. The mob was pressing against the wood hard enough to crack the frame, and Lot's family needed time. "Get your family out," Gabriel told Lot. "Everyone who belongs to you. Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone in the city. Get them out. We are going to destroy this place." Lot went to his sons-in-law, and they laughed at him. They had married into Lot's family and taken on Sodom's life along with its comforts, and they couldn't conceive that the city they'd built their lives in was about to stop existing. I watched their faces while Lot pleaded with them. It wasn't cruelty. It was disbelief, the blindness of men who have lived inside a thing so long that they can't picture its end. They stayed, and they died with the city they couldn't leave. Lot hesitated. Dawn was coming and he was still inside the walls, still trying to convince people who wouldn't be convinced, still lingering in a place he should have left long ago, back when Abram offered him first choice on the ridge and he looked at the green valley and saw paradise instead of poison. Michael and Gabriel took Lot by the hand and his wife and his daughters and pulled them out by force because Lot couldn't bring himself to leave on his own. Even then, God did not let him stay. "Flee to the mountains," Gabriel told them. "Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." They ran. Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters, running from a city that was about to burn, carrying nothing, leaving behind the life they'd built and the people they'd known and the sons-in-law who'd laughed when they were warned. Lot's wife looked back. I saw her turn, her face open to it as it happened. There was no defiance in it, but there was love. The city that had been her home, the neighbors she'd known, the life she built inside those walls. She loved it, and she couldn't let it go, and she turned to look at it one more time as the sky came down behind them. She became salt. She stood on the plain. Her body turned to a pillar of mineral, a marker left there in the open that I have never fully understood. The fire fell. I'd seen God's judgment before, the flood. But the flood had been water, and water is quiet even when it kills. This was fire and sulfur out of heaven, and it was not quiet. The first thing I felt was the heat, not on my skin, but in my spirit. The scar on my arm answered the fire before it reached the ground, flaring with a pain that ran opposite to its usual ache. Near the fallen, the scar had burned cold. Near this, near God's own judgment coming down, it burned hot, as if the darkness branded into me knew the light that was about to swallow every dark thing in those cities. Then the sound, not thunder, because thunder builds and rolls and fades. This was a steady roar, the sky tearing open and pouring destruction down with the precision of a single cut and the force of a mountain falling. The fire came down on Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole plain, and it came down nowhere else. The edge of the judgment was exact. Inside the line, nothing left, outside it, untouched ground. The buildings didn't burn as wood burns. They came apart. The brick and stone went white hot and cracked open, and the structures that had taken generations to raise fell inward in seconds. The streets I'd walked during the investigation, where I'd smelled the rot and felt the fallen pressing in on me, were consumed so completely that the ground itself melted and ran together into something that would never grow again. I watched from above, close enough to feel the heat rising, close enough that the light off the fire was brighter than anything I'd seen since the front where my shield broke. I couldn't look away, not because I wanted to watch, but because this was God's judgment, and I'd been made to witness it, and witnessing meant staying present when everything in me said, turn away. During the investigation, I'd noticed a woman in the Eastern Quarter, not part of the mob. She'd been standing in her doorway with a lamp, watching the crowd surge toward Lot's house, and her face had carried the look of someone who knew her city was sick and had nowhere else to go. She pulled her children inside and shut the door. 2 children. A boy and a girl, young enough to be carried. She wasn't one of the 10. I don't know what she believed, or who she prayed to, or whether she'd have left if anyone had warned her. I only know that when the fire fell, her house stood in the Eastern Quarter, and the Eastern Quarter burned like everything else. I couldn't save her, and I hadn't been ordered to. She wasn't part of the covenant line. She wasn't Lot. She was a woman with a lamp and 2 children in a place that was ending, and I don't know what God saw when he looked at her. I only know what was in front of me and what I couldn't do. I've carried her face since that night, the way I carry Hadel and cereal and every cost this war has taken from me. Not because I could have changed it, but because I saw it, and seeing is what I was made for, and some of what you see doesn't let you go. Everything the humans had built, everything the fallen had corrupted, everything that had stood in those cities for generations was gone in minutes. The fire stopped exactly as it had started, with no slow dying and no embers. One moment destruction, the next, nothing but quiet. The fallen gathered on the far edge of the plain, and for once, both sides watched the same thing without turning on each other. God's judgment, terrible and exact, taking the cities and leaving the plain beyond them, taking the wicked and pulling 4 people out ahead of it. When the fire stopped, nothing remained. Smoke rose from the plain like the smoke of a furnace. The ground where Sodom had stood was glass and sulfur and silence. The scar on my arm eased back to its usual low ache. The judgment was finished, the fire was gone, and what it left behind was a total absence. I stayed when the others dispersed. Serial found me in the ruins, alone, standing in what had been the market, where humans had traded goods and argued prices and lived their lives in the shadow of a corruption they'd long stopped seeing as corruption. He didn't attack. He didn't speak. He stood on the other side of the ruined street and looked at the wreckage, and his face held something I'd never seen on him before. Not the sharp calculation, not the careful provocation. He looked diminished. This had been his work. All those slow years of pressure and patience, and now it was ash. We stood in the silence for a long time, 2 old comrades in the wreckage of different losses, his foothold here and my shield, neither of us whole. "Your shield is gone," Serial said at last. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. He'd commanded me once, before the war, and he knew my equipment as well as he knew his own. "Yes," I said. He waited, then asked what had happened to it. "It needed to be done," I said. He looked at the ruins around him, at the ash that had been his long investment, then back at me. "We've both lost something," Serial said. His voice was quiet, not performing, not debating, just saying what was true. I didn't answer, because there was nothing to debate. He was right. The difference was that my loss had bought someone's life, and his loss was what came of building on rot. But standing in the smoke, neither of us said it. It sat in the air between us, plain and unspoken. "Lot was saved," I said after a while, not as an argument but as a fact. Serial inclined his head slowly. "One man, dragged out by his hands." He paused. "Is that enough for you, Kemuel?" "Is one man always enough?" "It has to be," I said. "It's how God works." Serial looked at me the way he used to look at ground he hadn't finished mapping, as if I'd become something he couldn't quite predict. "You're more open now," he said. "No shield, carrying that burn, and you came here anyway." "Yes," I said. He spread his wings, offering no last argument and no final challenge. He looked at the ruins one more time, and I saw something cross his face that in anyone else I would have called grief. Yeah, then he was gone. And I stood alone in the smoke and carried the woman's face and the empty place where my shield had been and the quiet of a city that wasn't there anymore. Abraham was watching from the ridge. I could see him in the distance, standing where he'd stood when he bargained with God, looking at the smoke, not knowing yet whether Lot had lived, carrying the weight of a man who had interceded for a city and lost it. But not lost everything. Lot was alive, and the promise still stood. And in Abraham's camp, in Sarah's worn-out body, the impossible thing had already begun. I turned away from the ruins and flew back toward Abraham's ridge. I took up my position. The scar ached in the sulfur-heavy air, but it ached less the closer I came to Abraham, the closer I came to the promise, the closer I came to the place where God was working. The long wait was nearly over.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.